Hello, I'm Joan. I'm a Canadian family physician who also works as a restorative medical educator, facilitator, and coach. I create spaces that rehumanize the work of healthcare. I'm creating this podcast to remind myself, as well as anyone else working in a helping profession, that when you are working and caring for your human patients, you are the other human in the room. Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. I am extremely excited for this conversation. The person I'm talking to today means a lot to me, has played different roles in my life without his knowledge, just based on things he's created in the world. He has a beautiful podcast and beautiful books of his own poetry, as well as collections of other people's. And I had the privilege of actually meeting him in person somewhat recently and experiencing what it's like to have him facilitate a workshop of poetry. And that's where we met. And he graciously then agreed to be on this podcast, which was amazing. I really appreciate this person's thoughts in general, and not just because he has a wonderful accent to me, but also because he is so thoughtful, and his backgrounds in poetry and theology, as well as conflict resolution. I just think that he has a really unique worldview, and I really wanted to have him on to talk, especially about conflict, because that's something that comes up in healthcare just a little bit. And so before we dive in, Pádraig, would you like to introduce yourself to those listening?
Hi, Joan. Thanks very much for having me. I am from Ireland, and I live most of the time in the States these days, in New York City. I studied theology. I worked for a long time in conflict resolution and community work in Belfast. And poetry has been a deep passion of mine my whole life. I was brought up in an education system that placed a lot of emphasis on poetry, so it's been a deep interest of mine. So theology, conflict, and poetry are the bloods in me.
Yes, what a wonderful combination. I was actually curious if you could share a bit about what it looked like to work in conflict resolution. Like, what does that actually look like day to day when you were doing that work?
I mean, it's the charitable sector, so most of the positions that I had were contracts of a year or 18 months or, those kinds of times, working as a freelancer across one of the many different peace organisations in the north of Ireland. So I'll give you a few different examples. In one example, I was sent with another conflict mediator to interview a whole load of people who were part of a minority group on a border city between the North and the Republic, to find out about their experiences of being a minority community. It was British Protestant people were the minority community there. It's a largely Catholic nationalist city, Nurias. So we were interviewing people there and looking at points of tension, points of misunderstanding, trying to find out ways within which you could preemptively feedback to city council and feedback to community organisations about how it was that community relations could be increased and improved. Another time I was artist in residence and a co-facilitator on a project led by a woman called Susan McEwen, and there were two villages, maybe 2 miles apart from each other, right in the heart of the north, rural villages, and there had been a terrible murder that occurred between them, an awful murder, because it was kind of like a Romeo and Juliet situation where there was a boy from one and a girl from the other were in a relationship with each other, and they were both shot. And so one was a kind of an Irish Catholic nationalist village by population, and the other, just 2 miles away, was a British Unionist Protestant village. And so all the community relations that had built up between these villages over decades were put under extreme tension and distress as a result of this awful murder. So on the invitation of people from the community, I was part of the team that came in, led by Susan McEwen, to bring people together to have situations of dialogue. We met, for 35 weeks, once a week, building up a community art exhibition of images and sketches and poems and stories that were designed then to just deepen the possibility of not rebuilding trust, because after a murder like that, I don't think rebuilding is the right metaphor to use, of looking at each other and talking to each other and finding ways to speak about what happened, speak about what that murder had brought up in terms of the lives of coping with murder and threat and disenfranchisement that so many people had in their history, and starting again maybe, or starting anew and trying to find a way to tell the truth. So those are two. I mean, sometimes conflict resolution also looks like working with two people who are having difficulties. Half the time we needed conflict resolution within peace organizations as well. You know, it's difficult to work with each other, and that isn't a sign of hypocrisy. It's natural that people who are part of a system that's seeking to address the difficulty themselves manifest the difficulty that they're seeking to address. That's entirely normal and entirely reasonable, and it's not in any way an indication that they're failing. It's an invitation, really, for them to hold themselves the recognition of this stuff is difficult. And then lots of time in conflict resolution, you're writing grant applications or writing reports from grant applications, or
Right.
you're working late or working early, setting things up or answering your emails so that you can do this stuff. I worked with clergy as well a lot of the time. I was interested in how it was that, having training in both theology and conflict, I'd be able to talk with clergy about how it is they spoke with and interacted with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex communities. That's almost like mediative discourse. It wasn't because that there was a formal mediation put into place. It was more saying, how can we build the tools and the relationships where people might be able to encounter somebody who represents the thing that they say they're talking about, in the possibility that some kind of transformation and dialogue could take place.
I realize that I forget if you originally said that you worked in conflict mediation or conflict resolution, but that speaking of language, which I know you care about a lot, I would imagine if you think you're doing conflict resolution, you might be doing maybe something slightly different than when you're doing conflict mediation.
Yeah. I mean, different schools of thought around the place define those things differently. So it would be very different in Canada, I'm guessing, in terms of how that's defined, as it would be at home. But yeah, I mean, mediation in a certain sense is mediating between particularly two parties or between two groups. Conflict resolution might be trying to take something more systemic into place. Some people prefer the term conflict transformation because, you know, it's rare that a conflict occurs outside of a system. And so often it isn't just the two parties that are fighting with each other or in tension fruitlessly with each other or with threat. You're often trying to say, well, what are the circumstances? What's the groundwork that could be done that would mean that when something like this occurs again, that actually it could be viewed more fruitfully, rather than just thinking it's only the fault of side A or side B. So there's all kinds of language that people use, depending as to where you are and depending as to what the trends are there.
Yes, I love conflict transformation, just because it's always fun to hear a different term than the usual.
I mean, it's aspirational.
Yeah, sure.
But it's a good aspiration. Yeah.
And maybe you're transformed either way, but is it intentional or not?
For sure.
Yeah. I was wondering either through that work, because I would characterize both myself personally and probably the culture I grew up in, Canadian, being a female, also evangelical Christian, previously. I would say one of my personality traits used to be being conflict averse. So, and, you know, other terms that are often used, people pleasing, you know, go along to get along, fawning, if you want to use little trauma terminology. And so
accommodating as well is used.
Ooh, accommodating. Yes. That one sounds nicer, actually. And that has been challenging for me personally as I became an adult, as well as a physician, where I'm in a place of leadership and power over people. And yet one of my core attributes is to not be in conflict with them. It caused a lot of strife and burnout, and I know I'm not alone. I was curious if your relationship with conflict, well, what it was originally, and if it shifted as you did a bunch of conflict work, or have you been someone who's always been somewhat comfortable with conflict happening around you?
Well, it's a whole load of things to define. The first one that comes to my mind is a great quote from Claire Mitchell, who's a brilliant sociologist based in Belfast. And she is talking about places where the conflict is layers deep. And she says, there's conflict about what the conflict's about. And I love that. And often I think that's true interpersonally as well. It's not just in places where there's histories of colonization and empire. A person can be conflicted about their relationship with conflict, just in and of themselves. And of course, we all have multiple relationships with conflict. First of all, with yourself. And then, you might have a really fruitful relationship with conflict between yourself and your art making, for instance, where the conflict just propels you forward to something fruitful, or creative, or sharpening, or learning. Or you might have a terrible experience of conflict with one sibling and a great experience of conflict with the other. Sports are a form of mediated conflict for the purpose of enjoyment and skill and winning and all of those kinds of things. So, I suppose I, like everybody, had a whole mixture of relationships with conflict. Some things I was really happy with and could enjoy, and others distressed me enormously. And that continues, I don't think there's anybody really for whom all experiences of conflict are all experienced easily. I tend to be somebody who is a natural accommodator. People would tend to say that conflict exists on the XY plane between accommodation and assertion. And that, in some things you can default to being very accommodating. In other things you might default to being really naturally assertive, or somewhere else on that XY axis that's occurring. And it depends on the circumstance and your power as to where you might locate yourself. And also then you might think, well, look, naturally in this circumstance, I'd be quite assertive. However, given that my boss is in the room, or given that, you're the only female in a room of males, or given expectations about age or race or how you present, therefore I know that if I assert myself, I'll be under the weight of other people's assumptions or prejudices. So there's all kinds of ways within which we modify even what's natural to us, depending as to what circumstances of conflict we find ourselves in. And sometimes your job necessitates that you have to be really assertive. If you're going to say to somebody, the symptoms that you're presenting me with today are going to change your life, that's a very assertive thing to say. And presumably the best thing to do is to say it calmly and kindly, but really clearly. And that's an assertive thing to do, rather than in a way where it's unclear, or, well, I'll tell you something if you tell me that you're okay with me telling you it.
Yes.
You don't want to be accommodating when you're in a situation of needing to assert something, some kind of truth that doesn't depend on the person's acquiescence as to how it's going to impact them.
That specific example, I can recall, you practice that in medical training.
I'm sure.
Breaking bad news.
Yeah.
And it's something that still, probably in good part because of that accommodation feature and a fear of big reactions and not knowing how to hold them. I can relate to and have seen in others a tendency to want to maybe not be the one to fully give the answer. I've seen actually examples of that where then, people unfortunately then arrive at the cancer center and no one's actually explicitly told them they had it.
I know, it's so confusing.
So much more distress than is needed, right?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
And so then, there's distress about distress. There's ways within which you might find something upsetting, but you're not entirely sure why. And there might be some things, maybe with a spouse, where in some things you go, we navigate conflict really easily and the conflict is fruitful. And other times you go, but except here, under these circumstances, something that normally would seem easy can seem difficult. So I think there's a lot of shame that some people carry about their relationship with conflict. And I think it's helpful to know that we all have multiple relationships with it. And to say in some situations you're absolutely fluent. And in other situations, Other things get in the way. And so part of it is to think, well, what do I want? What do I need to say? How much do I care about it? How much power is it having over me? How much can we change? How much is in our hands to change? All these kinds of questions. And then from there to choose something that's going to be fruitful.
I love like adding context. Any sort of personality trait label probably is being extremely reductive to the whole of a person.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Just like that.
Yeah, totally. If somebody says I'm an introvert, therefore I have this experience of conflict. I mean, those are two very reductive ways of thinking about yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, well, you just said the word fruitful conflict, which, well, 2 words. And I know I listened to your absolutely lovely podcast, Poetry Unbound, which you haven't actually said yet.
Thanks for the plug.
Yes, I'm sure everyone who listens to this listens to that, really. Also, I think last year you did this lovely series about how poems can be teachers, and it's centered around ideas of conflict. And on one of those, you use the word destructive versus generative conflict. Yeah. And I think, as someone who, at least in some situations, has a tendency to have aversion to conflict, it's useful to know that there are helpful, generative, fruitful forms of conflict. Not only is conflict inevitable, but it can be generative, create something positive, good. And I would love to hear more about what your thoughts and experiences are of what that can look like, maybe distinguishing features of it. Yeah. What can it look like? Especially in places where maybe sometimes more often we see examples of destructive conflict.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll start with the very personal. Like, I love poetry and I love writing poetry. And so every time I write a poem, I'm a kind of a ferocious editor. I'll usually have edited something 100 times before it'll see the light of day or anybody will hear it. And so, like, editing a poem is an experience of conflict because I'm saying there's a line here that isn't good enough. It needs to be sharpened. I've used too many words, or I need to push it. That's an experience of conflict. And so that's an experience of fruitful conflict where you're saying something isn't working, it needs to be improved, and I'm going to make it so. I mean, if the line could speak back, the line might go, "You're hurting my feelings." But, we understand in this silly example that the line isn't speaking back, and actually there's something better in place, that you're introducing conflict for the purposes of improvement. That's a very personal experience for me, but in many ways we all have elements of that, ways within which we all, in different manifestations, have aspects of perfectionism or improvement or increase or expertise or skill that we manifest, whether that's in your own parenting style or in your workplace or in the art that you like or in trying to get a personal best on a park run, all of these things. And we can often then train ourselves to say, well, here's how I'm going to make my conflict with my current performance more fruitful. So you might read a book about parenting, or you might do some strength exercises to increase your running speed, or you might read something or take a class on poetry editing or increasing your skill in music or art, or in order to make your experience of conflict more fruitful. I think the aspiration of democracy is that a referendum is an experience of fruitful conflict, because a referendum says there's an issue here that by and large you can split down the middle to say yes or no about, whatever that might be, and to say, it warrants having something, either because the constitution needs to change or because a community of people are pretty seriously split about this. And so what you want to do is that each side compromises with themselves and says, well, we're going to gather under this umbrella, the other side are going to gather under another umbrella, put together their aspirations, and then put it to the people in the hope that A, the people read the stuff, and then B, turn out to vote. So that is an experience of saying, yeah, we have conflict, and we know that we are not going to be able to satisfy everybody. And what we are going to do is to see about having the best versions of each side put forward so that people can take it into their own hands and then vote. And obviously people vote for all kinds of reasons in a referendum. Elections are the same. Those are major national experiences of trying to have experiences of fruitful conflict. A situation I mean, we use this phrase, everybody wants to get the same size piece of pie, and somebody might go, well, let's learn how to make pies. And that can be a helpful way to think about it. If you have a group of people that say, look, resources are going to the community or the section of the city that's already over-resourced, and our section of the city or community is under-resourced, and we want to find a way to do something here. And so, a good city councillor might say, well, let's find a way where all the needs can be met, because we want to honour needs in all parts of the community, as well as needs in between. So sometimes what you're trying to do is to reframe what people might say, this group of people, this neighbourhood, this community, this population are entirely at fault. And you're wanting to find a way to say, well, what if we shifted the frame a little bit and said, actually what's at fault is under-resourcing, or what's at fault is misunderstanding or projection. And let's find a way where it's possible for everybody to feel like they have at least most of their needs met. Those are all ways to say, look at what we can do, and look at what's possible when you find a way to say, my God, like what started off as difficulty has turned into something helpful.
Definitely the underlying issue being under-resourcing rings true in healthcare.
I know, yeah.
It's certainly where I live and work. And I can think of specific examples. So speaking of, like, say, conflict that can happen between different groups of clinicians, like often online dialogue, which was, I mean, it often is the most vicious, so as a family physician, and I'm in a group with also specialists, the specialists say, why can't family physicians do more? And then all the family physicians say, why can't the specialists do more? And then the emergency docs say, everyone stop sending everyone to us. And, everyone hates the nurse practitioners because they're not doctors, and the pharmacists. Honestly, I'm being sort of humorous, but also it's quite painful.
Believe it. Yeah.
And really, we are all in this together. Literally, there's not enough of us, and there's a lot of need. And I struggle. I'm curious how, I am one of many, so it won't be that my one individual action will then generate the conditions to make such dialogue generative.
Yeah.
That would be cool if I could press a button and make that happen. And I'm, based on your experience or what what do you find is helpful to set up the conditions of conversation amongst people who maybe view themselves as being in conflict with each other in that kind of way, where it's really there's a systemic thing underneath. What can help people see each other more clearly and see that the conflict in some ways exists sort of external to the actual humans involved?
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing, Joan, in terms of the different sectors of medical responses to trying to provide for a community's well-being and health, I can map something similar from the peace world onto it. So you might have a place of systemic injustice, and you'll have some people who are doing human contact work. So they're bringing representatives from different communities together for the purposes of learning and mutual sharing. And then you'll have people who are doing policy work, and people who are doing reparations work, or historical inquiry work, or educational reform, or political reform. And often what will happen is that all of those different organisations are overworked and underpaid, and they are each competing for a limited pot of money that's available for their work. And so therefore they're brought into competition with each other. So you might get the policy people saying, look, my God, what would the human contact people know about changing policy? And then the human contact people would say, what do you know about mediating a room where people have been victims of violence? Or etc. What does... you understand totally what I'm saying. Yeah. Somebody will say, look, educational reform is all well and good, but that's going to be limited to a political cycle. And so all the work in this is only going to last 3 or 5 years before it's going to be up in the air again. And so often what I try to do in those situations is to find out who are all of the good initiatives that are working. I like to think of it as a field, and everybody's in a different part of the field. A permaculture field where there's undulations and not just a rectangular field. And different pieces of the field grow things for different purposes. And how is it that people in that field, whether that's the field of medical approaches or the field of peace responses or the field of responding to the legacies and the impacts, the contemporary impacts of colonization, How is it that people who are all working to address the injustice can not waste so much time fighting against each other? Because the question for me is, who's winning while we're fighting? While the peace people are fighting amongst themselves, somebody else is winning to say, look at those people, they can't even sort themselves out. Let's reduce the amount of money that they're getting, or whatever it is. Or let's find something where somebody's going to be gossiping about somebody else and use it as a way of getting another political agenda across. Or pit people against each other in order to create a drama while you slip some piece of policy through that's going to make that work more difficult in the future. So much of it, for me, is about looking at what are models of collaboration that can occur, and how is it that people who are doing different kinds of work can have respect for the other kinds of work that need to happen. They don't need to do it. Like if somebody doesn't want to do human contact work, they don't have to, because there's plenty of other good work to be done. Or if somebody doesn't want to do policy work, there's plenty of other great places to occur. But, human contact and policy and educational reform and funding and political change and all of those things, they will all need to collaborate at some point. And it can often be assumed that when we have the jigsaw correct, well, then collaboration will happen automatically. That has never been the case yet. Collaboration always needs to work, and it usually needs to work in situations that are less than perfect. And so in a situation like this, it's a really good idea for communities of people to say, while we're waiting for the ideal circumstances to come, let's create an environment where we can build trust with each other, in order that when I need to get some piece of policy, I can easily pick up the phone and say to somebody, do you have any policy work on this? Rather than them saying, oh God, here you are now with your tail between your legs, suddenly needing us and suddenly honouring our work. And that's entirely possible, I think, for once you have leadership in the situation that is not going to fall into a certain kind of divide and conquer that is internal to a sector, that is responding to a need in the public.
Yes, I find it is often trickier if certain leaders from certain factions, part of how they are trying to keep their faction together is by separating them from the other. Which is a common tactic that, but as you say, it doesn't actually help everyone in the field to generate more growth, right?
Totally. I mean, I don't know, and I have, visited and met you and your colleagues in Hamilton, but I haven't heard this from anybody. But I can imagine that somebody could garner a lot of support, perhaps of the wrong kind, by coming into a job and saying, look, let's get one thing straight from day one. Medical administration is absolutely getting in our way, and we're going to have fewer medical administrators. And you get a whole load of people going, yay! And then you get a lot of medical administrators wondering how are increases and improvements going to be monitored, and are they going to lose their job, and are they going to be subject to ridicule? And what you're doing in that situation is setting up, on the one hand, experiences of loyalty, and on the other hand, perhaps unwittingly, experiences of threat. And how on earth is that going to be useful when you need to collaborate with each other?
I have literally heard, you say you haven't heard that, but I've literally heard people say that exact thing in multiple committees or meetings, including people. Sometimes it's medical administrators themselves trying to get buy-in from physicians, but often it's physicians saying it with administrators. And I have always winced thinking, okay, it's not like a personal attack on someone's character, but it is. It's not the most generative.
It's not. And for me, it's not that I want people to stand up and go, oh, you're all amazing, you're all wonderful. No, sure. That's fruitless too. Yeah. What you are wanting to say is to go, there's things I don't understand about why it is that we need these steps, but I'd love to learn. And I'd love to find a way, can we improve it for all of our well-being? So these kinds of collaborations are actual collaborations coming from co-labor to work together. And part of working together is to say, we know each other well enough that I can say to you what other people are saying about you, which is to say, I just don't understand why it is that we need 20 pieces of paper or 20 steps when actually it would seem to me that we could do them all in 2 steps. Is there a way that we can work together to make this happen? And then the person might go, well, here's why. And to go, well, let's collaborate together. Because they might say, well, actually, we're protecting you by those 20 steps. This is really for the practitioner's self-protection in a litigation society or something like that. So how is it that you can say the thing and say it clearly and sharply even, but with enough relationship that you will be able to say, well, let's work together on something that's actually going to be an improvement, rather than making ideological statements that are just seemingly going to make a new scapegoat and say it's all this group of people's fault or that group of people's fault. That's not going to help.
So it's a bit of, shaping and being thoughtful of what you identify as the problem.
Yeah.
and making it a what instead of a who.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, so that I think about, so that those kind of conflicts we've just been talking about, where we end up pitting against each other, and it at least is more clear. Look at the frame. Look at the crowded room we're in that's making us all not like bumping up against each other. You know? And maybe I'm more aware of it, or maybe it's getting worse. I'm not sure. But more and more, and certainly in the healthcare sector, some very clear examples have emerged since 2020 of ideological differences causing conflict. And I can speak to, like, within my own family, and that's one of the people I interviewed was my dad, who has both a physician and has opposing or certainly differing ideological differences, even about medicine, even about what was the right way to go with COVID-19, with the vaccine, these things.
Yeah.
And those have been not just because it's personally causing conflict, obviously, but like even like amongst yourself and then a patient who now wears garments and like that signal different beliefs than you. It can feel really impossible to consider how you could begin conversations that are generative in conflict with those things, because it feels so entrenched and so emotional, versus necessarily a problem that you're trying to solve together. That's not a question. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, there's a friend of mine uses the phrase, stay in your lane. I don't know where it comes from. Maybe some kind of sport. Running, maybe. I don't know. But it's helpful. There was a group of us once getting together talking, and somebody was describing a really, really difficult circumstance at work, and this person was in education. And the friend, the stay in your lane friend, said, like, you are being dragged outside of your educational responsibility here. You are there that this person gets an education. However, you're being brought in to be this role in their life, that role in their life, another role in their life. And my friend, the stay in your lane friend, said to the one who was distressed, like, what you probably need to do is to find a way where you can say really clearly and carefully to the student, I'm here for you to learn. And all of these other things, like, of course I have opinions about them, but that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to help you learn, and I'm here to be alongside you in order for you to learn. And some of these other questions, A, of course, we both know that we think differently, but B, it's just going to be fruitless. And I'm not paid to be in that role in your life. And so I want to be able to leave here knowing that I've done a really good job with you in this area of my responsibility. And I think one of the things that can happen with conflict, of course, is that it can escalate. And in situations where conflicts can seem ideological, and where my opinion about a certain thing morphs into my identity as to who I am, that is believable, but it can suddenly mean that it can be difficult to provide one single service to somebody when you think that their entire being is in opposition to you or in denial of you. And so therefore, part of me thinks this is just a survival tactic, but part of me thinks that simply to say, here's what my job is in this circumstance. And for some people in some sectors, that can actually just mean that they're not going to get distressed, because it's going to be fruitless to enter into certain conflicts that are not going to be solvable within the context of a medical meeting or something like that. And people who do need to ask these ideological differences and who do need to bring those things into the room and whose job it is, well, then I hope that they're trained to do that. often what happens is I think that leadership defaults its anxieties onto people who are not paid or trained in order to solve some of these ideological differences. So therefore you have all this distress happening in the community, and the people whose job it should be to manifest, here's what it looks like for people in leadership of different points of view to meet together and to ask questions that are to the betterment of the entire population that they're tasked to lead. Those people can just say, well, no, it's all polarized. Partly it's polarized because they're not doing the work of leading, and part of leadership is demonstrating collaboration. Leadership is not just winning 50.1%. Leadership is something that is about saying, if you have won 50.1%, how is it that you can lead 100%?
Oh, that rings so true. And I wonder if people listening I think sometimes we in medicine, we need to have a deeper understanding of where our lane begins and ends. So a specific example coming to mind is vaccine conversations with patients, right?
Yeah.
So I think we can think that our job is to vaccinate 100% of the patients who come through our doors. Otherwise, we've failed. I feel like I had that sort of shame story if people said, no, I didn't do a good enough job. And people can get, when you think that's your job, speaking of conflict resolution. So it's like, if I have to think that by the end of this visit, I have to resolve this conflict in one direction, it has to be my direction.
Yeah.
Well, does that ever go well, Pádraig? You
No.
No.
Whereas, if when a patient came into a clinic and you were to say, I know vaccination is controversial at the moment, and while it seems like most people agree with it, there's a population of people who don't. And to say, my job isn't to convince you, it is to make it easy for you to make the decision that you want to make. You don't have to tell anybody what decision you made, but I'm going to put I'm going to put the information before you. I know and love people who have made different decisions. That's different than shaming somebody to say, well, if you're smart, you're going to be like me, otherwise you're a fool. I mean, when on earth has shaming somebody or giving them your disdain or your disgust, or even deeper, your contempt, when has that ever been fruitful for a community of people? But contempt is one of those primal energies in us, and so often what we see these days is ways within which contempt is commodified into being able to prove which is the better side to be on. You can say, I'm on this side because we all share the experiences of having received contempt from that other group. Or the other group then might say, well, we're all here because we have contempt for that other group. That doesn't help. If there's a way of creating a narrative where you're also protecting yourself, you're also saying, it isn't my job to solve your ideological differences. Yeah. It is my job as a scientist to say to you, here's the information, and to say to the person, I will not judge, and nor will I disclose what's going on. Here's the information for you, and you make the decision.
It's a lot less stressful for me, since I would say that's been a shift. And I would, maybe I was already on a journey of it, but certainly when it was specifically the COVID-19 ones, and then there was I really felt like this extra pressure of there was messages like primary care, get everyone vaccinated, and you're like, I'm trying, but and it just made it clearer than ever, I have to make sure if I am taking responsibility for something, it's actually within my control.
Totally.
And it became way less of an intense and tense interaction when I knew where my lane actually ended.
Totally. Yeah. And understandably, if anybody's having anything put into their body, even if they're giving consent, that's a certain kind of an ethical violation. When I was studying theology and we were looking at surgery, there was, part of looking at the ethics of surgery is to say it is a violation of the integrity of the body for you to consent to a scalpel being used to cut your body open. It's fruitful, but it's not easy, and it's understandable that even though you've given absolute permission and something's been successful, that at a certain level afterwards you'll feel like, oh my God, what has happened to my body by having open heart surgery, for instance, on a very dramatic level. And so, of course, people want something to be respected when we're talking about this.
Absolutely. I think the other piece of this ideological part that actually a poem that I think you've read on Poetry Unbound, and then it was also in the book Poetry Unbound, is oh shoot, I should have had it in front of me. It's about rightness. I actually have it. I'll just say the title of it, because
Yehuda Amachai, from the place where we are right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I've read that poem so many times, because I won't read it, but the notion of it is that, yeah, when we are standing in the place where we think we are, well, this is my interpretation of it. Let's put it that way. When I'm standing in the place where I think I have to be right and I am right, that place is like the ground is dead. There's nothing to bloom. But I think, what is it? Doubts and loves are the things that then unearth your ability.
Dig up the world.
Yes. Yeah. Doubts and loves, that's like so beautiful. So the notion of, can we leave space for uncertainty, even as scientists? I mean, scientific method means we're never actually certain of anything. Actually.
Exactly.
And loves, like, remember that we are humans and they are humans. That was a very helpful poem to me.
Yeah. I love the bravery of that poem by Yehuda Amachai. It's so much based on locale, from the place where we are right. And it goes, flowers will never grow in the spring. And he uses this reference to a ruined house that's there, and the implication of is there's something to learn about the ruined house that's on this land. And then, as you said, he said, doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, like a plough. The idea is, coming back to the metaphor of fruitfulness. How is it that where we are, something might grow in the spring, and something might live in the land, and we might have a fruitful and nurturing relationship with the land. And what's so brave about what he's saying is that it isn't just love, it's also doubts, and doubts about whether what I think is loving is loving. And that goes to the heart of ideology, because often you turn to an ideology because you have the hope that it will love you back. And this is saying, well, what if it doesn't? What if, like many people in the history of the world, we're being asked or brought into the situation of thinking, maybe I'm wrong. It doesn't mean I'm a fool. It doesn't mean I'm terrible. Maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe I wasn't given the right information. And can I ask a question of my own group? Or will I be told, well, you're a traitor? That's what's so brilliant about Yehuda Amachai's very, very short poem, which is political. He's an Israeli poet, the most famous Israeli poet of the 20th century. And, his family had been told, go back to Palestine from Germany in the 1930s. And they did. They went back to Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, in the 1930s, before the outbreak of the Second World War. And then after the establishment of the State of Israel, he was, on the one hand, of course, an Israeli poet, and on the other hand, a critic of his own community, to say, let's ask some serious questions. Some people think he didn't ask enough. Some people think he asked too many. It's not my lane to decide that. I'm not a historian. What I think is so brave is that he was saying, I want to sidestep the question as to the idea that asking or posing serious queries necessarily means that I'm a traitor. Doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, like a plough.
That's just so beautiful. I also am definitely going to steal the phrase, it's not my lane to have an opinion about that,
You can credit Chris from Belfast.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Just truly, there's a bit of always everyone thinking they have to not only be right, but even just have a firm stance on anything and everything, and humility of the earth. Or, what if sometimes what is beautiful about knowing your limits and staying in lanes that you have experience and knowledge and passion for, and then that means you have so much more space to be open to hearing and learning from other people.
Yeah,
that sounds like a good thing. Thank you so much, Pádraig. As we draw to a close, I just wonder, so I usually invite podcast guests to consider the audience. So most people listening work in healthcare, not everybody, which is fun. But I think people who listen are people who recognize that something about how we are trained and how healthcare is built, the systems and the structures, don't really encourage, in fact, they discourage us from really remembering our humanity as those of us who work in it. And we learn a lot of inhuman, dehumanizing stories about ourselves that then end up shooting not only ourselves in the first foot, but also then we accidentally and intentionally can perpetuate a lot of harm for our patients and colleagues. And so people are maybe a bit burnt out and they're struggling, but they want to know how they can be a bit more human and feel a bit more human as they go about their work in healthcare. And so not having all the answers for them, that's way too much pressure. But what words of encouragement or wisdom would you want to share with them?
Well, I think I'd be remiss not to mention poetry. I've loved poetry my whole life. I just went to the local village school where I'm from in Cork, but poetry was part of the educational curriculum the whole way throughout school. And there's something about poems that is so compelling to the human condition that poetry has arisen in every single human culture, as has art and music and dance, of course. But the arts has done that. And so especially for people who are drained and exhausted and facing threat where, you're getting critiqued from patients or from politicians and everybody in between, and maybe your colleagues as well. The understandable thing to do is to just seek absolute recovery and rest from that, But there is something fascinating about how often we turn to what is creative, because when we make something, it makes us back. There's a strange transfer of power and agency that happens when we make something. And making something it might be painting, it might be writing a poem, but it can also be cooking soup, and it can also be engaging with some language that is fruitful, especially during a time when you might have come to dread language. During a long, extended, exhausting conflict mediation that I was working on, where ultimately it was not successful because one of the individuals was much more interested in elongating it than in any kind of resolution, I realized that I was waking up at 4:30, and my immediate thoughts were going to this conflict. I thought, I am wasting my time. I'm arriving into work exhausted. So I thought, screw it, because I kept on thinking, whenever this conflict is over, I'll start to spend a bit more time editing poetry. And I thought, screw it, I'm just going to start editing poetry now. So I started to read more and to edit more. I arrived into work having traversed the universe in conversation with Emily Dickinson, and then felt like my mind was refreshed in order to be able to cope with and to listen to where somebody else is trying to drag me into their drama, and to say, I have my own creative drama that I am loving every single morning. Me, poetry, Emily Dickinson, and tea. And that might just be 5 minutes. It's not like, it doesn't have to be a long time, but something where you preserve the integrity of your own making capacity that can, even if it is only 5 minutes, that can expand and expand. And it can be kind to you, and it makes you back when you make time for it.
Ah, that's so lovely. And the tea, definitely, as a fellow tea drinker, I co-sign that element.
I suffer in America, Joan. I suffer.
No. It's not.
I bring my own kettle and my own tea bags.
I love it. So, well, as long as you come prepared,
and my own judgment, I should say. I should just make that really clear.
That's okay. It's whether it's for you. That's the whole point. It's all right. You're not demonizing the other necessarily. And I will actually say, so like the workshop that Pádraig facilitated that I was a part of was for this Department of Family Medicine, but it was about poetry. And ever since then, I have been writing poetry. I keep being like, I'm doing a thing that's like, but
really?
Technically, they're poems. I don't know what gets to count as a poem, but I think they count. And
of course they do.
It's been really lovely. I'm a long-standing journaler, and there's something, I'm kind of still doing the same thing where I'm writing down my thoughts and observations, but there's something about saying that I'm writing poetry and,
that's so lovely.
And having more brevity. And I'm not trying to rhyme or anything, but it's been really wonderful. So thank you so much for opening that portal for me.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed being there.
All right. So with that, everyone listening, the healthcare humans, thanks as always for offering us your ears. And I always like to leave you all with an invitation. So this time, even for 5 minutes, how can you really protect and expand the part of you that wants to create something? And if you're a perfectionist like me, you think you've got to be the best or the most brilliant, but that's not the point. The point is simply you already are doing something like that. I'm sure there's something that you can do or have in the past known to do. That what would happen if you protected a tiny bit of time each day and then helped that remind you of your humanity? I've personal practices of that I love so much. So that's my invitation to all of you. And Pádraig, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Joan. Lovely to be with you.
All right. And for everyone listening, I'll talk to you next week. I would love to take this work deeper with you. Visit joanchanmd.com today and discover my growing menu of options for restorative medical education to suit your learning needs. I offer one-on-one coaching, customized workshops, and self-study courses that allow you to connect not only with my work on a deeper level, but also with other healthcare humans just like you. So if you want to start humanizing your work in healthcare to a deeper level and do it in community with others, please visit joanchanmd.com and find those options and what fits you and your life today.